The moment Margaret Ashford stepped into the dining hall, she knew something was wrong. Every candle in the room seemed to lean toward her, and every pair of eyes followed with the same cold curiosity a hawk gives a mouse it has not yet decided to catch. She had expected a quiet corner of the table, a place where she might disappear into the noise of forks and polite conversation. Instead, a footman led her directly to a seat near the head of the table, close enough to the Duke of Ashcombe that she could see the faint scar above his left eyebrow. She had never met him before tonight. She had never expected to. 3 weeks earlier, a letter sealed with the Duke's own crest had arrived at the small cottage where she lived with her aunt. It requested her presence at a private dinner at Ashcombe Hall. No explanation was given. No reason was offered. Margaret had read the letter 4 times, certain it was a mistake, certain some clerk somewhere had confused her modest name with a lady of real consequence. Her aunt had wept with joy and insisted she attend, saying such an invitation did not arrive twice in a lifetime. Margaret had packed her only good dress, a faded blue silk that had once belonged to her mother, and told herself she would simply observe, eat quietly, and leave before anyone noticed her. That plan had lasted exactly as long as it took Lady Charlotte Vane to open her mouth. "How curious," Charlotte said, her voice carrying easily down the long table as the first course was served. "I do not believe I have had the pleasure of your acquaintance, Miss Ashford. Tell me, which family are you connected to? I confess I cannot place the name at all." The question landed like a slap dressed in silk gloves. Margaret felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her spine straight and her hands folded neatly in her lap, the way her mother had taught her long before poverty had taken the lessons of pride away and replaced them with the lessons of survival. "My father was Henry Ashford," Margaret said quietly. "He was a merchant." A ripple of laughter moved through the guests, near enough to hear, quiet but unmistakable, the kind of laughter people use when they want to wound without seeming to have moved at all. Charlotte's smile widened, satisfied, like a cat that has found a mouse cornered exactly where it wanted it. "A merchant," Charlotte repeated, letting the word sit in the air as though it were something distasteful she had found on her plate. "How very unusual. I wonder what could possibly have earned a merchant's daughter a seat at His Grace's table." Margaret said nothing. There was nothing safe to say. She glanced toward the head of the table, hoping perhaps for some small rescue, some word from the man who had summoned her here in the first place. But the Duke of Ashcombe simply watched, his expression unreadable, his dark eyes moving from Charlotte to Margaret and back again, with the patience of a man studying a chessboard, rather than a man witnessing cruelty at his own dinner table. He said nothing. He did nothing. And that silence hurt Margaret more than any of Charlotte's words, because it told her, quite plainly, that whatever reason had brought her here, protection was not part of it. Margaret glanced around the hall, taking in details she had missed in her first nervous moments. The table stretched long enough to seat 30 guests, each place set with silver that caught the candlelight and threw it back in small, cold sparks. Portraits of Ashcombe ancestors lined the walls, their painted eyes seeming to watch the proceedings with the same detached judgment as the living guests below them. She thought of the small cottage she shared with her aunt, where a single candle usually lit the whole of their supper, and felt the distance between that life and this one stretch wider with every passing minute. Her aunt had warned her, gently, before she left. "Do not expect kindness from people who have never needed to earn anything for themselves," she had said, tucking a loose strand of hair behind Margaret's ear the way she used to when Margaret was a girl. "Expect only that they will test you, and hope only that you pass the test with your dignity intact." Margaret had thought she understood those words. She realized now she had not understood them at all, not truly. Not until she felt the full weight of 30 strangers deciding, within moments of her arrival, that she did not belong among them. The dinner continued, and so did the small cruelties. A gentleman across the table asked, with false innocence, whether Margaret's dress had been made by a proper seamstress or stitched at home. Another guest wondered aloud whether merchants' daughters were taught to read at all, or whether Margaret had simply memorized a few polite phrases for the occasion. Each comment was small enough to deny if challenged, and together they formed a wall of humiliation that pressed in tighter with every course that was served. Margaret ate almost nothing. She answered when she had to, kept her voice low and even, and refused to let her eyes fill with the tears that gathered stubbornly at the edges of her control. She thought of her father, dead 5 years now, and the disgrace that had followed his death like a shadow that never left. She thought of the whispers that had followed her and her aunt from their old house to the small cottage where they now lived on almost nothing at all. She had believed, foolishly perhaps, that those whispers belonged to her old life, a life she had left behind when she packed her mother's blue dress and came to Ashcombe Hall. She saw now how wrong she had been. The whispers had simply been waiting for her here, dressed in finer clothes and sharper words. She caught sight of her own reflection in the polished silver of a serving dish, distorted and pale, and barely recognized the frightened girl staring back. This was not who she wanted to be. She had survived 5 years of scraping together enough coin for bread and coal, 5 years of neighbors crossing the street rather than greet a family touched by scandal, 5 years of holding her aunt's hand through nights when the grief and shame felt too heavy to carry. She had not survived all of that only to crumble in front of strangers who knew nothing real about her life or her father's true character. The thought steadied her more than she expected, and she found she could breathe again, slowly, carefully, without her chest feeling as though it might collapse. Across the table, a young gentleman she did not recognize watched her with an expression she could not quite read, something between curiosity and sympathy, though he said nothing to defend her. No one did. She understood then that in a room full of powerful people, silence was its own kind of choice, and every guest at that table had chosen not to help her. Perhaps, Charlotte said, leaning forward with the practiced grace of a woman who knew every eye in the room was hers to command. Miss Ashford could tell us about her father's business. I understand it ended rather badly. Ruin, was it? Debts he could not pay? The table went quiet in a different way now, a hush of anticipation rather than idle amusement. Margaret felt her pulse pounding in her throat. She had spent 5 years building a wall around that particular wound, 5 years refusing to speak of the accusations that had followed her father to his grave, the whispers of fraud and dishonesty that had never been proven and never been disproven, simply left to hang over her family's name like a permanent stain. My father's affairs are not a matter for dinner conversation, Margaret said, and though her voice trembled slightly, it did not break. How defensive, Charlotte said, exchanging a knowing glance with the gentleman beside her. One might almost think there was truth to the rumors. Margaret's hands tightened in her lap until her knuckles turned pale. She thought of standing, of excusing herself, of walking out into the cold night air and never looking back at Ashcombe Hall or its cruel guests again. But something in her, some stubborn ember of pride her father had left her along with his ruined name, refused to let her run. If she left now, she would be leaving as the disgraced merchant's daughter Charlotte wanted her to be. She would rather stay and be humiliated than give Charlotte the satisfaction of watching her flee. She lifted her chin instead, and met Charlotte's gaze directly. I would think, Margaret said, her voice steadier now, that a rumor repeated at a dinner table says more about the person repeating it than the person it concerns. For a moment, silence fell so complete that Margaret could hear the fire crackling in the great hearth at the far end of the hall. Charlotte's smile faltered, just slightly, just long enough for Margaret to see the flicker of surprise beneath it. And then, for the first time since the dinner began, the Duke of Ashcombe spoke. Well said, Miss Ashford. His voice was quiet, but it carried through the hall with an authority that silenced every other conversation at once. Every head turned toward him. Charlotte's face went pale, then flushed with something that looked very much like fear. The Duke rose from his chair, unhurried, and every guest at the table rose slightly with him in that automatic way. People respond to power even before they understand why. He looked at Margaret for a long moment, and for the first time that evening, she saw something in his expression that was not cold calculation, but something closer to respect, and beneath that, something that looked almost like guilt. I owe you an apology, he said, addressing her directly now, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent hall. I invited you to this table tonight for a reason I have not yet explained, and I allowed you to sit through cruelty I should have stopped the moment it began. That was a failure on my part, and I will not compound it by staying silent any longer. Charlotte's fingers gripped the edge of the table. Margaret felt her heart pounding so hard she was certain the entire room could hear it. There is a reason you are here tonight, Miss Ashford, the Duke continued, his eyes never leaving hers, and it has nothing to do with your father's business failing, and everything to do with the truth of what actually happened 5 years ago. A truth I have spent the better part of a year uncovering. The room seemed to hold its breath. Margaret gripped the edge of the table, unsure whether to feel hope or dread, unsure which was more dangerous. Whatever the Duke was about to say, she understood in that moment that her life, and the life of her family's ruined name, was about to change forever, and there was no way to stop what was coming. Margaret's fingers dug into the edge of the table, as the entire hall waited for the Duke of Ashcombe to continue. Charlotte Vane had gone rigid in her seat, her earlier confidence replaced by something tighter, something closer to alarm, though she tried to mask it behind a brittle smile. 5 years ago, the Duke said, his voice carrying through the silent room. A merchant named Henry Ashford was accused of defrauding 3 of his business partners. He lost his fortune, his reputation, and eventually his health. He died believing himself guilty of crimes he did not commit, and he left behind a daughter who has spent every year since carrying the weight of a lie. Margaret's breath caught. No one outside her own household had spoken her father's name with anything but scorn in 5 long years. To hear the Duke speak of him now, in front of the very people who had mocked her only minutes earlier, felt like watching a door open onto a room she had believed sealed forever. "I did not know your father personally," the Duke continued, turning his attention fully to Margaret now, "but I knew of the men who ruined him. One of them sits at this table tonight." A murmur swept through the guests, quiet but electric, the sound of 30 people simultaneously wondering which among them was about to be named. Some guests glanced nervously at their own hands, as though reviewing their own private dealings for anything that might draw similar scrutiny. Others leaned forward eagerly, sensing the kind of scandal that would fuel drawing-room conversation for months to come. Charlotte's eyes darted toward the far end of the table, toward a stout, silver-haired gentleman who had said little all evening, content to watch the cruelty unfold rather than participate directly in it. Margaret followed her gaze and saw the man's face had gone the color of old paper. She recognized him now, though only distantly, from a memory buried deep beneath 5 years of grief. He had visited her father's warehouse once, before everything collapsed, dressed in fine clothes and speaking in the smooth, confident tone of a man used to being believed without question. Her father had trusted him. She remembered that clearly. Remembered her father speaking warmly of a business associate who understood the shipping trade better than most men in London. She had never imagined that warmth would be repaid with ruin. "Lord Edmund Carow," the Duke said, and the name landed like a blade dropped onto stone. Carow rose halfway from his seat, his composure cracking at the edges. "Your Grace, I fail to see what business this is of yours, or why you would raise such matters at a dinner table, of all places." "I raise it here," the Duke said, "because you chose, 5 years ago, to ruin a man's name at a dinner table very much like this one. You accused Henry Ashford of fraud in front of half of society, knowing full well the debts belonged to you, not to him. You forged his signature on documents that transferred your losses onto his shoulders, and you let him die still believing the shame was his to bear." The hall erupted into a low, frantic buzz of whispered conversation. Margaret sat frozen, unable to fully absorb what she was hearing. 5 years of silence, of shame, of watching her aunt weep quietly over unpaid bills, and the memory of a husband's brother who had died disgraced. And here, finally, was an answer she had never dared hope to hear spoken aloud. "This is outrageous," Carow said, though his voice lacked the conviction to match his words. "You have no proof of such claims. I will not sit here and be slandered in front of my peers." "I have every proof," the Duke said calmly, and nodded toward a servant standing near the door, who stepped forward carrying a leather portfolio tied with dark ribbon. "Letters in your own hand, correspondence with your solicitor discussing how to shift your debts onto Ashford's accounts before the collapse became public. Bank records showing the true source of the missing funds. Sworn statements from 2 former clerks who witnessed you altering the documents yourself." Margaret watched, transfixed, as the Duke untied the portfolio and laid several papers on the table where the nearest guests could see them. She wanted to move closer, to read the words herself, to confirm with her own eyes that this was not some elaborate dream she would wake from in her cold cottage bed. But her legs would not obey her. She simply sat, frozen between disbelief and a hope so sharp it nearly hurt. A gentleman seated near the papers leaned forward, adjusting his spectacles, and read a line aloud under his breath before catching himself and falling silent again, his expression troubled. Word of what the documents contained seemed to travel down the table without anyone speaking directly, passed along through widened eyes and quiet, urgent whispers. Margaret had spent 5 years imagining this moment in 100 different forms, always certain it would never actually arrive, and now that it had, she found herself almost unable to trust it as real. "How did you come by these?" Carow demanded, his face now fully drained of color. "This is a private matter, buried and settled years ago." His hands trembled as he spoke, and he glanced toward the doorway as though calculating the distance and the wisdom of fleeing before the conversation could continue. But the room had grown too watchful, too many eyes tracking his every movement, and he seemed to understand that any attempt to leave now would only confirm what the papers already suggested. "Nothing built on a lie stays buried forever," the Duke replied. "I have spent the better part of a year gathering this evidence, Lord Carow, ever since I learned that my own father's business dealings brought him into contact with yours, and that he suspected the truth long before his death, but lacked the courage or the proof to speak it aloud. I decided I would not make the same mistake he did. Charlotte, who had been silent through this exchange, suddenly found her voice, though it came out thin and uncertain. Your Grace, surely this can wait for a more appropriate setting. You are embarrassing Lord Caro in front of the entire company. Lord Caro embarrassed himself the moment he chose to destroy an innocent man to save his own fortune, the Duke said, and though his tone remained even, there was steel beneath it now that silenced even Charlotte's protests. And you, Lady Vane, might consider your own position in this matter before you continue to speak on his behalf. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Margaret saw Charlotte's composure crack fully for the first time that evening, her eyes widening with something close to panic. I do not know what you mean, Charlotte said, though her voice betrayed her. I mean, the Duke said, that Lord Caro is your uncle, Lady Vane, and that your family's fortune has been quietly propped up by his for the better part of a decade. I imagine you knew rather more about tonight's true purpose than you have let on. The hall fell utterly silent. Margaret looked from Charlotte to Caro and understood, finally, that the cruelty she had endured all evening had not been idle mockery at all. It had been strategy. Charlotte had known, or at least suspected, that the Duke intended to expose her uncle tonight, and she had tried to discredit Margaret before that exposure could take place, hoping perhaps to paint her as unworthy of belief, unworthy of sympathy, before the truth could be spoken. Caro, seeing the tide of the room turning irreversibly against him, made one last attempt at defiance. This is a conspiracy, Your Grace. You invite a merchant's daughter to dine among her betters and then stage this theater to ruin a man of standing. I demand you produce witnesses, real witnesses, not servants paid to lie. The clerks who signed these statements no longer work for you, Lord Caro, which means they no longer fear you, the Duke said. And as for witnesses, I believe there is one at this table who has waited 5 years for the chance to speak. Every eye turned to Margaret. Her heart pounded so hard she was certain the whole room could see it beating beneath her worn blue silk. She had not expected to be asked to speak. She had not prepared words, had not rehearsed a single sentence for a moment like this, because she had never imagined such a moment would come. I do not have documents, Margaret said slowly, rising from her seat despite the trembling in her knees. I do not have letters or bank records. What I have is memory. I remember my father coming home the night the accusations began, and I remember him swearing to my mother, with tears in his eyes, that he had signed nothing, agreed to nothing, and understood nothing of the debts suddenly attached to his name. I remember him writing letters to men who never answered, begging for the chance to clear his name before it was too late. I remember watching him grow smaller and quieter every week after that, until the man who used to sing to me at breakfast could no longer find the strength to leave his bed. Her voice shook, but she did not stop. 5 years of silence pressed against the walls of her chest, demanding release, and she found she could not have held the words back even if she had wanted to. He died still apologizing to us, Margaret continued, for a crime he never committed. I have carried that shame for 5 years, not because I ever believed he was guilty, but because the whole world seemed to believe it, and I had no way to prove otherwise. If Lord Caro wants real witnesses, then let him look at me. I am the daughter of the man he destroyed, and I have waited 5 years for someone, anyone, to say the words Your Grace has spoken tonight. The hall remained silent for a long moment after she finished, and then, slowly, one guest began to clap, followed by another, until a ripple of applause moved through the room, uncertain at first and then growing steadier. Margaret felt tears finally slip free, but they were not the tears of shame she had fought all evening. They were something else entirely, something she had not felt in 5 long years, and it took her a moment to recognize it as relief. Caro, seeing the room turn fully against him, pushed back from the table so abruptly his chair scraped loudly against the floor. You will regret this, Your Grace, he said, though his voice had lost all its earlier authority. All of you will regret siding against a man of my standing. I regret only that it took me this long to gather the proof, the Duke said. You are welcome to leave, Lord Caro, though I suspect the magistrates will have questions for you before the week is out. Caro stormed from the hall without another word, and Charlotte, pale and shaken, rose to follow him, though she paused at the doorway and looked back at Margaret with an expression that was not quite an apology, but was no longer pure malice either. Then she, too, was gone, leaving the hall buzzing with the astonished conversation of 30 guests who had come expecting a quiet dinner and instead witnessed the unraveling of a lie 5 years in the making. The guests who remained began to speak among themselves in hushed, urgent tones, already reshaping the story of the evening into something they would repeat at breakfast tables and card parties for weeks to come. A woman near the far end of the table caught Margaret's eye and offered a small, genuine nod, the first gesture of respect Margaret had received from a stranger all evening. Another guest, an older gentleman with kind eyes, rose briefly to bow toward her before resuming his seat, a silent acknowledgement that the truth had finally found its way into the light where it belonged. Margaret sank back into her chair, her legs no longer able to hold her upright. The Duke crossed the room to stand beside her, and for the first time all evening, he looked less like a powerful stranger, and more like a man carrying his own quiet burden of guilt. "I am sorry," he said quietly, so only she could hear. "I should have spoken sooner, and spared you the worst of tonight's cruelty. That was a failure of judgment on my part, and I do not ask you to forgive it easily." Margaret looked up at him, still trembling, still trying to absorb the enormity of what had just happened, and found she did not have an answer ready. 5 years of grief and shame did not simply dissolve in a single evening, no matter how satisfying the vindication. But something had shifted tonight, something fundamental, and as she looked into the Duke's dark, careful eyes, she understood that her father's name was only the beginning of what she was about to learn about the man who had summoned her here. The hall emptied slowly after Caro and Charlotte fled into the night, guests lingering in small clusters near the doorway, reluctant to leave before they had exhausted every possible whisper about what they had just witnessed. Margaret remained seated near the head of the table long after the last carriage wheels had crunched away over the gravel drive, too stunned to move, too exhausted to trust her own legs. The Duke dismissed the remaining servants with a quiet word and lowered himself into the chair beside her, closer than propriety strictly allowed, though after the events of the evening, neither of them seemed inclined to worry about such things. "You must have questions," he said. Margaret let out a breath she felt she had been holding for 5 years. "I have 100 questions, Your Grace, and I hardly know where to begin." "Begin wherever you like," he said. "I owe you honesty, at the very least, after tonight." She turned to face him fully, studying his features in the candlelight for the first time, without the weight of humiliation clouding her judgment. He was younger than she had first assumed, perhaps only a few years older than herself, with the kind of careful stillness that came from a man who had learned early to guard his emotions closely. There was tiredness in his eyes, the particular exhaustion of someone who had carried a private burden for a very long time. She noticed, too, the small details she had missed earlier in the chaos of the evening. A faint ink stain on the edge of his sleeve, as though he had spent long hours at a writing desk rather than at leisure. A restlessness in his hands, which he kept folded carefully as though to still them by force of will. He did not carry himself like the other noblemen she had glimpsed that evening, men who wore their titles like armor and their wealth like a weapon. He seemed, instead, like a man who had inherited a burden he had never quite learned how to set down comfortably. "You are staring, Miss Ashford," he said, though there was no offense in his tone, only quiet amusement. "Forgive me," she said, feeling color rise in her cheeks for a different reason than it had all evening. "I am trying to understand a man who would spend a year of his life pursuing justice for a family he had never met. Perhaps I am trying to understand that myself," the Duke admitted. "Why me?" Margaret asked finally. "You could have exposed Lord Caro in a courtroom, or through solicitors or in a private letter to the appropriate authorities. Why stage such a public confrontation, and why invite me to witness it, knowing what Lady Vane and her circle would do to me before you spoke?" The Duke's jaw tightened, and for a moment he looked away, toward the dying fire in the great hearth. "That is the question I dread most, because the honest answer does not flatter me." "I would rather have honesty than flattery," Margaret said. "I have had enough flattery in my life to know how little it is worth." He nodded slowly, as though her words had confirmed something he already suspected about her character. "My father knew your father, though only slightly, through mutual business dealings in the shipping trade. When the scandal broke 5 years ago, my father suspected the truth, or at least suspected that the story being told did not add up. He was not a bold man, my father. He preferred quiet observation to open confrontation, and he chose to say nothing, to protect his own standing rather than risk it on behalf of a merchant he barely knew." Margaret felt something cold settle in her chest. "Your father knew, and said nothing." "He knew there was reason for doubt, and he said nothing," the Duke confirmed. "He died 2 years ago, and among his papers I found notes, fragments really, suspicions he had never followed through on. Names, dates, small inconsistencies in the story Lord Caro had told society. It was not proof, not yet, but it was enough to make me ashamed of what my father had chosen not to do." "So you decided to finish what he started," Margaret said quietly. "I decided I would not carry the same guilt to my own grave," the Duke said. "I spent the better part of a year gathering evidence. tracking down the clerks who had since left Caro's employment, finding the bank records that proved where the true debts originated. It was slow work and careful work, because Caro is a powerful man with powerful friends, and a single misstep would have given him time to destroy the evidence or discredit me before I could act. That still does not explain why you invited me here tonight, knowing what would happen before you spoke, Margaret pressed. The Duke was quiet for a long moment before answering. I wanted Caro to believe the evening was nothing more than an ordinary dinner, an unremarkable gathering with an unremarkable guest, added for reasons no one would think to question. If I had announced my intentions beforehand, or protected you visibly from the moment you arrived, he would have suspected something was wrong and found a way to disappear before I could confront him properly. I needed him comfortable, confident, careless. I am ashamed to say that your comfort was not weighed carefully enough against that need. Margaret absorbed this in silence, feeling a complicated tangle of emotions she could not easily separate. Anger, that he had used her humiliation as a tool in his own plan. Gratitude, that after 5 years, someone had finally cared enough to seek the truth. And something else, harder to name, something that had been growing quietly since the moment he rose from his chair and silenced the room with nothing but the sound of his voice. You could have warned me, she said. Even a small word beforehand, some hint of what was coming, would have made the evening easier to bear. You are right, the Duke said, and there was no defensiveness in his voice, only quiet acceptance. I told myself that warning you might have shown on your face, might have alerted Caro that something was planned, but I think, if I am honest with myself, I was also protecting my own plan more carefully than I was protecting you, and that was a poor trade to make with another person's dignity. Margaret found herself unexpectedly moved by the plainness of his apology. She had spent 5 years surrounded by people who twisted the truth to suit their own comfort, who offered excuses dressed as explanations, who never once admitted fault without immediately softening it into something more forgivable. The Duke's willingness to simply say he had been wrong, without excusing it away, struck her as rarer than any grand gesture could have been. Tell me about my father, she said instead, changing the subject before her feelings could grow any more complicated than they already were. You said your father found inconsistencies. What were they? The Duke reached for the leather portfolio still resting on the table, and drew out a smaller bundle of papers, separate from those he had shown Caro earlier. These are the notes my father left. He believed your father had discovered the fraud shortly before the scandal broke, and had confronted Caro privately, threatening to expose him unless the debts were properly reassigned. Caro, rather than face exposure, moved first, accusing your father publicly before your father could act. It was a desperate move, but an effective one. Society believes accusations far more readily than defenses, especially when the accuser strikes first and loudly. Margaret took the papers with trembling hands and scanned the unfamiliar handwriting. Notes scrawled in the margins of old letters, dates circled, question marks beside certain names. It was strange to see her father's tragedy reduced to notes and fragments. Evidence gathered by strangers who had never known him as anything more than a name in a scandal. And yet there was comfort in it too, proof that the truth had mattered enough to someone, even a stranger, to be worth pursuing. She traced a finger over one particular line, where the Duke's late father had written a single question in the margin, asking why a man as careful as Henry Ashford would have signed documents so carelessly against his own interest. It was a small thing, a passing doubt jotted down perhaps in an idle hour, but it struck Margaret with unexpected force. Someone, even briefly, even without acting on it, had looked at the story society accepted so easily, and had seen the cracks in it. She wondered how many other quiet doubts had existed over the years, unspoken, unfollowed, allowed to fade rather than risk the discomfort of confrontation. Your father's notes were not enough on their own, the Duke said, watching her study the pages. I want to be honest about that. Doubt is not proof, and I could not have brought these suspicions before a magistrate without more. It took months of careful work, tracing the clerks who had since scattered to new positions, persuading them that speaking the truth now carried less risk than the silence they had kept for years. Were they afraid of Lord Caro? Margaret asked. Very much so, the Duke said. One of them had been dismissed without reference after raising a private concern about the accounts, years ago, and had struggled to find steady work since. He agreed to speak only after I assured him I would see he was compensated fairly for the risk, and protected from any retaliation Caro might attempt. Margaret felt a fresh wave of gratitude at the careful, deliberate nature of the Duke's investigation. This was not the work of a man seeking glory or drama, but of someone methodical, patient, willing to spend real effort protecting the vulnerable people whose testimony he needed. It was, she realized, very much the opposite of how her father had been treated 5 years earlier, accused loudly and publicly with no such care given to fairness or truth. He confronted Caro, Margaret repeated softly. He never told us. My mother and I never knew he had discovered anything before the accusations began. We simply watched him grow desperate and confused, insisting on his innocence with less and less strength each week, as though he understood the fight was already lost before it truly began. I imagine he was trying to protect you both, the Duke said gently. A man confronting a fraud of that scale would have understood the danger he was inviting into his household. Perhaps he hoped to resolve it quietly, without frightening his wife and daughter with the full extent of the threat. Margaret pressed the papers to her chest, feeling tears threaten again, though these were different from the tears of humiliation she had fought earlier in the evening. These were tears for a father she now understood more fully than she ever had while he was alive, a man who had tried, in his own quiet way, to protect his family, even as his world collapsed around him. Thank you, she said finally, for this. For all of it, even the parts that were difficult tonight. I do not think I can fully forgive the humiliation, not yet, but I understand now that it was not cruelty for its own sake. You do not need to forgive it tonight, the Duke said. You do not need to forgive it at all, if you find you cannot. But I hope, in time, you might allow me the chance to make amends properly, beyond simply restoring your father's name. Margaret studied him carefully, searching his expression for any trace of the calculation she had seen in Charlotte's eyes, or the false innocence she had heard in Caro's protests. She found none, only quiet sincerity, and beneath it, something that looked almost like hope. What happens now? She asked. With Lord Caro, I mean. Will there be a trial? I intend to bring the evidence before the appropriate magistrates within the week, the Duke said. Given what was witnessed tonight, and given the documents themselves, I do not believe Caro will find many allies willing to defend him. Society turns quickly against those who fall from favor, and Caro fell rather spectacularly this evening. And Lady Vane? The Duke's expression grew more thoughtful. Charlotte's involvement is less clear. I believe she knew something of tonight's purpose, or at least suspected it, given her efforts to discredit you before I could speak. Whether she knew the full extent of her uncle's crimes, I cannot say with certainty. That is a question I intend to pursue further, though carefully, since accusations without proof are precisely the kind of injustice that ruined your father in the first place. Margaret nodded, grateful for his caution, even as a part of her wished for swifter justice against the woman who had led the evening's cruelty with such practiced ease. But she understood, better than most, the danger of accusations made without sufficient care. She would not wish that particular horror on anyone, not even Charlotte Vane. The candles had burned low by the time their conversation finally slowed, and Margaret realized with some surprise that the anger and humiliation of the evening's beginning had gradually given way to something calmer, something almost peaceful. She still did not know what to make of the Duke of Ashcombe, this careful, guilty, determined man who had upended her entire life in a single evening. But she found, as she rose to take her leave, that she was not entirely opposed to learning more. I will send a carriage to bring you back to Ashcombe Hall once the legal proceedings begin, the Duke said, walking her toward the entrance hall where her cloak waited. Your testimony, should you be willing to give it, would carry significant weight. I am willing, Margaret said without hesitation. I have waited 5 years to speak the truth about my father. I do not intend to stay silent now that someone is finally willing to listen. The Duke smiled then, the first genuine smile she had seen from him all evening, and it transformed his face entirely, softening the careful guardedness that had defined his expression since she first arrived. Your father would be proud of you, Miss Ashford, I think, for the courage you showed tonight. Margaret felt the words settle somewhere deep in her chest, warm and unexpected. She thought of the countless nights she had lain awake beside her aunt's small hearth, wondering if her father's memory would ever be anything other than a source of whispered shame, wondering if she herself would ever be seen as anything more than the daughter of a disgraced man. To hear those words spoken so plainly, so certainly, felt like setting down a weight she had carried for so long she had nearly forgotten what it was to walk without it. As she stepped out into the cool night air toward the carriage waiting to take her home, she found herself looking back at Ashcombe Hall with entirely different eyes than the ones that had first regarded it with dread. Whatever came next, whatever trials and difficulties still lay ahead in clearing her father's name completely, she no longer faced them alone, and that, after 5 years of solitary grief, felt like the greatest gift anyone had given her in a very long time. The magistrate's chamber was smaller than Margaret had imagined, plain wood paneling and a single narrow window that let in thin winter light. She sat beside her aunt on a hard bench, her hands folded tightly in her lap, waiting for her name to be called. It had been 11 days since the dinner at Ashcombe Hall, 11 days of anxious waiting while the Duke's solicitors prepared the case against Lord Carow, and now, finally, the moment had arrived for Margaret to speak the truth before men, with the power to make it matter. Her aunt squeezed her hand. "Your father is watching, I am sure of it. Speak plainly, and let the truth carry itself." Margaret nodded, though her stomach twisted with nerves. She had not seen the Duke since the night of the dinner, though he had sent word twice, brief notes assuring her that the investigation continued to strengthen, and that her testimony, when the time came, would matter greatly. She had read those notes more times than she cared to admit, searching them for some warmth beyond the practical, though she told herself firmly that such searching was foolish and unbecoming of a woman in her position. The 11 days between the dinner and this moment had passed strangely for Margaret. Word of what happened at Ashcombe Hall had spread quickly through the surrounding villages, carried by servants and tradesmen who delighted in repeating the story to anyone who would listen. Margaret had gone from being a name whispered with pity or scorn, to a name spoken with something closer to fascination, though she found the attention nearly as uncomfortable as the old shame had been. Neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid her now nodded politely when she passed, and the local shopkeeper who had always demanded payment in advance had begun, without explanation, extending her modest credit once more. Her aunt, for her part, had wept with relief the morning after the dinner, clutching Margaret's hands and saying over and over that Henry would finally rest easy, wherever he was, knowing his daughter had not let his name die in disgrace. Margaret had held her aunt through that morning's tears, grateful beyond words that some measure of peace had finally reached the woman who had sacrificed so much to keep them both fed and sheltered these past 5 years. When her name was finally called, she rose and walked into the chamber with her chin lifted, the same posture she had forced herself into at the Duke's dinner table 11 days earlier. The room was full, magistrates seated at a long table, clerks scratching notes, and near the back, unexpectedly, the Duke himself, watching her with an expression of quiet encouragement that steadied her more than she wanted to admit. Lord Carow sat near the front, flanked by a solicitor who looked increasingly uncomfortable as the proceedings continued. He did not meet Margaret's eyes as she took her seat before the magistrates, though she saw his jaw tighten at the sound of her name. "Miss Ashford," the lead magistrate said, "you have been called to testify regarding the character and circumstances of your late father, Henry Ashford, in connection with the fraud charges brought against Lord Edmund Carow. Please tell us what you remember of the weeks before the scandal became public." Margaret took a steadying breath and began to speak, describing the evening her father had come home pale and shaken, the whispered arguments she had overheard through her bedroom door, the letters he had written and never received answers to. She spoke of watching him grow smaller each week, of the family's slow slide from comfort into poverty, of her mother's illness that followed close behind the shame, as though grief itself had been a sickness that spread through their household. "He never confessed to any wrongdoing," Margaret said, her voice growing steadier with each sentence. "Not once, not even in his final days, when men in his position often seek to unburden their conscience before death. He insisted always that he had signed nothing, agreed to nothing, and understood nothing of the debts suddenly placed at his door. I did not fully understand, as a girl of 16, why the world seemed so eager to disbelieve a man who had never once lied to his own family." The magistrates listened in careful silence, and Margaret felt, for the first time, the strange power of being truly heard. She was not being mocked, not being dismissed as an inconvenient obstacle to someone else's comfort. She was simply being listened to, her words weighed for their truth rather than judged for her modest station, and the sensation was so unfamiliar it nearly undid her composure entirely. She continued, describing the final weeks of her father's life, when illness had taken hold of him as surely as despair had, though the physicians of the time could never quite agree on which had come first. She spoke of nights spent at his bedside, reading to him from books he no longer had the strength to hold himself, and of the quiet moments when he would grip her hand and murmur apologies for a future he feared he had ruined for her. She had promised him, in those final days, that she would not let the world's judgment define who she was, though she had spent 5 years afterward wondering if that promise had been foolish, a comfort offered to a dying man rather than a truth she truly believed. "I did not understand until recently how much that promise would come to matter," Margaret told the magistrates. "I made it to ease my father's final days, but I have spent every year since trying to keep it, even when it seemed the world had already decided who I was and what I deserved." Carow's solicitor rose to question her, attempting to suggest that a daughter's testimony was inherently biased, that grief and loyalty might color her memory of events she had witnessed only as a child. Margaret answered each question calmly. refusing to be rattled, drawing on the same stubborn steadiness that had carried her through the humiliation of the Duke's dinner table. "I understand that a daughter's love for her father might be questioned," Margaret said, when pressed a final time. "But I would ask the court to consider which is more likely, that a modest merchant risked everything he had built to defraud men far more powerful than himself, or that a man already deeply in debt found it convenient to shift the blame onto someone with far less power to defend himself." A murmur of approval moved through the chamber, and even one of the magistrates allowed himself a small nod before catching himself and returning to his notes. Caro's solicitor sat down without further questions, and Margaret was excused from the stand, her legs weak with relief as she returned to her seat beside her aunt. The proceedings continued for the better part of the day. Witness after witness called to confirm the details the Duke's investigation had uncovered. The clerks who had once worked for Caro testified to the altered documents, describing in careful detail how they had been instructed to change dates and figures under threat of dismissal. A banker confirmed the true source of the missing funds, tracing the money not to Henry Ashford's accounts but to a series of poor investments Caro himself had made and desperately needed to conceal. By the time the final witness had spoken, the case against Caro had become nearly impossible to deny. Margaret watched him grow smaller in his seat as the day progressed, the same slow diminishment she remembered from her father's final months, though she felt no satisfaction in the resemblance, only a tired, hollow recognition of how quickly power could crumble once its foundation of lies was exposed. When the magistrates finally called a recess, the Duke crossed the chamber to where Margaret sat, and lowered himself into the empty seat beside her. "You spoke well," he said quietly, "better than well. I do not think there is a person in this chamber who doubts your father's innocence any longer." "I only spoke the truth," Margaret said, though she felt a flush of pride at his words regardless. "The truth is not always so persuasive on its own," the Duke said. "It takes courage to speak it plainly, especially before men who hold such power over the outcome. I have watched grown men falter under far less scrutiny than you face today." Margaret studied him for a moment, noting the genuine warmth in his expression, so different from the careful, guarded stillness she had first encountered at his dinner table. "How much longer will the proceedings continue?" "A few more days, I expect," the Duke said. "The evidence is strong enough now that I doubt Caro's solicitors will continue to contest it much further. He will lose his title's privileges at the very least, and I suspect a significant portion of his remaining fortune besides, much of which by rights should be restored to your family." Margaret had not considered this possibility, too consumed by the emotional weight of clearing her father's name, to think practically about what restoration might mean. "I do not need his fortune, Your Grace. I only wanted the truth known." "Perhaps," the Duke said gently, "but your father built that fortune honestly, and it was stolen from him through deceit. There is no shame in accepting what is rightfully yours, especially when it might allow you and your aunt a life free from the hardship you have endured these past 5 years. The words settled over Margaret slowly, and she found herself unexpectedly moved by the thought, not of wealth itself, but of the simple relief it might bring her aunt, who had sacrificed so much these past years to keep them both fed and sheltered. She thought of her aunt's hands, roughened from years of work she had never been raised to do, and felt a fresh wave of gratitude toward the man sitting beside her, who had set all of this in motion with nothing to gain for himself beyond the quiet satisfaction of righting an old wrong. She thought, too, of the small comforts she had long ago stopped allowing herself to imagine: warm coal through the winter months, new shoes before the old ones wore through entirely, the occasional sweet treat from the village bakery that she had once loved as a girl and had not tasted in years. Such things had seemed like foolish luxuries during the hardest of the past 5 years, indulgences she had trained herself not to want. Now, faced with the possibility of their return, she felt almost embarrassed by how deeply the thought of simple comfort still moved her. "I will not pretend the money means nothing to us," Margaret admitted quietly. "My aunt has given up so much, comforts she once took for granted, so that I might have enough to eat, and a roof that did not leak in winter. If some portion of my father's fortune can be restored, I would see her comfortable again before I would spend a single shilling on myself." "That does not surprise me," the Duke said, "given everything I have observed of your character these past weeks." "Why do you care so much about this, Your Grace?" she asked finally, the question she had wanted to ask since the night of the dinner. "You mentioned your father's guilt over his silence, but that alone does not fully explain a year of careful investigation on behalf of strangers." The Duke was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the window where thin winter light fell across the floor. "I think, Miss Ashford, that I have spent much of my life watching powerful men avoid consequences for choices that ruin the lives of those with less power to fight back." My father was not a cruel man, but he was a cautious one, and his caution cost your family 5 years of suffering that might have been prevented. I did not want to become a man who watched injustice unfold and told myself it was not my responsibility to act. Margaret felt something shift in her chest at his words, a warmth she had not expected to feel toward a man she had known for barely a fortnight. She thought of her father, and the quiet courage he had shown in confronting Caro privately even knowing the danger it invited. She thought of the Duke, spending a year of careful, patient work to finish what his own father had left undone. Two men, separated by wealth and title, both trying in their own imperfect ways to do right by people they had wronged or failed to protect. "Thank you," she said simply, "for not becoming that man." The Duke turned to look at her fully, and for a moment, something passed between them that neither seemed quite ready to name. A quiet understanding that had grown steadily since the humiliation of that first dinner, through truth and testimony, and the slow, careful rebuilding of a family's honor. The magistrates called the chamber back to order before either of them could speak further, but Margaret carried the warmth of that unspoken moment with her for the remainder of the long day's proceedings, a small, steady comfort against the exhausting weight of reliving her father's ruin before a room full of strangers. Lord Caro was stripped of his standing within a fortnight, his lands seized to repay the debts he had spent 5 years hiding, and a substantial portion of the recovered fortune restored to Margaret and her aunt, exactly as the Duke had predicted. The village that had once whispered about the disgraced merchant's daughter now spoke of Margaret Ashford with a different kind of interest entirely, curious about her sudden change in fortune, and eager to claim old acquaintance where little had truly existed before. Margaret found the attention exhausting in its own way, though vastly preferable to the scorn she had endured for so long. She and her aunt moved from their small cottage into a modest but comfortable house on the edge of the village, large enough for a proper kitchen and a small garden where her aunt could finally grow the roses she had always loved but never had space to plant. It should have felt, Margaret thought, like the ending to a story she had stopped believing could ever be hers. The new house had come as a surprise to Margaret in more ways than one. She had expected relief, certainly, and gratitude for the simple comforts she had long denied herself. What she had not expected was the strange grief that accompanied leaving the small cottage where she had spent 5 difficult but formative years. It was in that cottage that she had learned to mend her own clothes, to stretch a single loaf of bread across 3 days, to comfort her aunt through nights of quiet weeping without ever once losing her own composure. Leaving it felt in some small way like leaving behind the version of herself that had survived those years, even as she stepped gratefully into a life that no longer demanded such constant survival. Her aunt adjusted more easily, delighting in the larger kitchen and the modest staff the restored fortune allowed them to hire, a cook and a single maid, who helped with the heavier work neither of them had the strength to manage entirely alone. Margaret watched her aunt's shoulders relax week by week, the permanent worry lines around her eyes softening, as the fear of an empty larder or an unpaid bill finally began to fade. It was worth every strange, unsettling adjustment, Margaret thought, to see her aunt finally at ease. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something else entirely, something she was not yet certain how to name. The Duke visited more often than strict propriety demanded, always with some practical reason attached to justify the calls, papers requiring her signature, updates on the settlement of Caro's remaining debts, questions about how she and her aunt were adjusting to their new circumstances. Margaret found herself looking forward to these visits with an eagerness that unsettled her, a warmth that had nothing to do with the practical matters he claimed to bring, and everything to do with the quiet, careful way he listened when she spoke, as though her words carried real weight rather than simply filling silence. "You are frowning, Miss Ashford," the Duke observed one afternoon, seated across from her in the small parlor while her aunt tended the garden just visible through the window. "I hope I have not brought unwelcome news." "No unwelcome news," Margaret said, setting aside the papers he had brought for her review. "I was only thinking how strange it is to sit across from you now discussing settlements and signatures, when a month ago I sat across from you at a dinner table, wishing only to disappear." The Duke's expression grew serious. "I think of that evening often, and not with pride. I hope you know that." "I know it," Margaret said. "You have told me as much, more than once." "Perhaps I feel the need to keep telling you," he said, "until I am certain you believe it." Margaret studied him for a long moment, noting the careful vulnerability in his expression, so different from the cold, unreadable stillness he had shown at that first dinner. "I believe it, Your Grace. I forgave the manner of that evening some time ago, once I understood the reasoning behind it, even if I still wish it had unfolded differently." "Julian," he said suddenly. Margaret blinked, uncertain she had heard correctly. "Your Grace?" "My name," he said, a faint flush rising in his cheeks, unexpected on a man who had commanded an entire hall into silence with a single sentence. Julian, I find I would like you to use it, if you are willing. The formality between us feels increasingly strange, given everything we have shared these past weeks. Margaret felt her own cheeks warm in response. Julian, she repeated softly, testing the shape of it. Then you must call me Margaret, and dispense with the formal address as well. Margaret, he said, and something in the way he spoke her name, simple and unadorned, made her heart quicken in a manner she had not experienced in longer than she cared to admit. Their conversations grew easier after that afternoon, less bound by the practical matters that had first justified his visits, and more inclined toward genuine exchange, stories of childhood, observations about the changing seasons, quiet confessions about fears and hopes neither had voiced aloud to another living soul. Margaret learned that Julian had lost his mother young, raised largely by tutors and a father too consumed by his own quiet anxieties to offer much warmth. She began to understand the careful stillness she had first mistaken for coldness as something closer to caution, the guarded manner of a man who had learned early that showing too much of himself invited disappointment. She told him in turn of her own childhood before the scandal, of long summer afternoons spent at her father's warehouse watching the ships unload their cargo, of her mother's gentle laughter, and the small kindnesses that had made their modest household feel richer than any grand estate. She spoke of the years after, carefully at first and then with growing openness, describing the particular loneliness of being pitied by neighbors who had once considered her family their equals, the quiet humiliation of watching invitations dwindle and then stop altogether as her family's fortunes collapsed. Julian listened without interruption, without the false sympathy she had grown accustomed to receiving from those who offered comfort only to satisfy their own sense of charity. His silence felt different, attentive rather than merely polite, and Margaret found herself sharing details she had never spoken aloud to anyone beyond her aunt, small memories and old griefs that had sat quietly inside her for years, waiting perhaps for someone patient enough to receive them properly. You carry it well, Julian said one afternoon, after she had described the particular sting of watching a childhood friend cross the street, rather than acknowledge her in public. The weight of it, I mean. I do not think I would have managed half so gracefully, had our circumstances been reversed. I did not always carry it gracefully, Margaret admitted. There were nights I wept until I had no tears left, nights I railed against the unfairness of it all, until my aunt had to remind me that anger, however justified, would not put food on our table. Grace is easier to see from the outside than it feels from within. Perhaps, Julian said, but I suspect that is true of most difficult things. The people who manage them well rarely feel as though they are managing well at all. I was afraid that first evening, Julian admitted one afternoon, as they walked together through the small garden while her aunt watched with poorly disguised approval from the kitchen window. Not of Caro, though I suppose I should have been. I was afraid of you. Margaret laughed, genuinely surprised. Afraid of me? I was a frightened stranger in a borrowed dress, unsure why I had even been invited. You were composed, Julian said, in a way that unsettled me. Every insult Charlotte and her circle threw at you, and you simply absorbed it, refusing to break, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing you crumble. I had planned that evening for a year, rehearsed every possible outcome, and I had not planned for the possibility that the woman at the center of it all would prove stronger than every calculation I had made. I did not feel strong, Margaret admitted. I felt as though I might shatter at any moment. Perhaps, Julian said, but you did not shatter, and I found myself, somewhere in the middle of that dinner, far more concerned with protecting your composure than with executing my plan against Caro. It frightened me, how quickly my priorities shifted. Margaret felt something warm bloom in her chest at his words, though a small cautious part of her remained wary, remembering how quickly comfort could be stripped away, how recently she had believed her family's disgrace to be permanent and unchangeable. She had learned, through hard experience, not to trust good fortune too easily. I do not know how to trust this, she admitted quietly, stopping beside a rose bush not yet in bloom. A month ago, I had nothing beyond my aunt's small cottage and a ruined name. Now I have a restored fortune, a comfortable home, and a duke walking beside me in my own garden speaking of feelings I hardly know how to answer. It feels as though it might all disappear as quickly as it arrived. Julian turned to face her fully, his expression earnest. I cannot promise you certainty, Margaret. Life has taught neither of us that certainty is something freely given, but I can promise you honesty, and patience, and the truth that whatever I feel for you did not arrive with your restored fortune. It began that first evening, Watching you refuse to break beneath cruelty, I should have stopped sooner, and it has only grown steadier with every conversation since." Margaret's breath caught, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the quiet of the garden settling comfortably around them. A bee moved lazily between the unopened rosebuds, and somewhere beyond the garden wall, a cart rattled along the village road, ordinary sounds that seemed strangely vivid against the significance of the moment passing between them. She thought of the countless times over the past 5 years she had imagined a moment like this one. Always in idle daydreams she scolded herself for indulging, certain that a life so thoroughly disgraced could never hope for anything so tender. She had trained herself, out of necessity, to expect little and hope for less, believing that hope itself was a luxury poverty and shame could not afford. Standing now in a garden she had never dared imagine owning, listening to a duke speak of feelings that had grown steadily since her lowest, most humiliated moment, she felt the careful walls she had built around her own heart begin, cautiously, to soften. "I spent 5 years believing no future worth wanting would ever be mine again," Margaret said quietly. "I told myself I had made peace with a small, quiet life, caring for my aunt, asking nothing more of the world than to be left alone. It was easier than hoping for something better, and watching that hope disappointed." "And now?" Julian asked gently. "Now I find myself standing in a garden with a man who makes me believe hope might not be so foolish after all," Margaret said. "It is a frightening thing, after so long spent guarding against disappointment." "I understand that fear better than you might expect," Julian said. "I have spent much of my life guarding against a different kind of disappointment, watching my father retreat into caution rather than risk genuine connection with anyone, myself included. I promised myself after his death that I would not repeat his mistake, that I would not let fear of loss prevent me from pursuing what mattered. I did not expect that promise to be tested so thoroughly, or so soon, by a woman I met under such difficult circumstances." She thought of her father, and the promise she had made him in his final days, that she would not let the world's judgment define who she was. She thought of 5 years of grief and hardship, of whispered scorn and quiet shame, and of how far she had traveled from that frightened girl who had first read the Duke's letter with disbelief. "I do not know what comes next," Margaret said finally, "but I find I am no longer afraid to discover it." Julian's smile, when it came, held none of the careful guardedness she had first encountered. "Then perhaps we might discover it together, if you are willing." Their moment was interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps on the garden path, and Margaret turned to see her aunt approaching with an expression of some agitation, a letter clutched in her hand. "Forgive the interruption," her aunt said, slightly breathless, "but this arrived by urgent messenger, addressed to Miss Ashford directly, marked with Lady Vane's seal." Margaret felt a chill move through her despite the warm afternoon sun. She had heard little of Charlotte since the night of the dinner, only rumors that she had retreated from society entirely following her uncle's disgrace, her own reputation badly damaged by association, even though no formal charges had ever been brought against her directly. Margaret took the letter with cautious fingers, breaking the seal while Julian watched with visible concern. The letter was brief, written in a hand that seemed less steady than the confident script Margaret remembered from invitations Charlotte had once sent mocking her modest circumstances. Charlotte wrote that she wished to speak with Margaret directly, alone if possible, regarding matters she claimed had weighed on her conscience since the night of the dinner. She named a time and a place, a small tea house on the edge of the village, neutral ground for a conversation she insisted could not wait much longer. "You need not go," Julian said immediately, reading the concern plain on Margaret's face. "Whatever Charlotte wishes to say, she has no claim on your time or your forgiveness." "Perhaps not," Margaret said slowly, folding the letter carefully. "But I find I am curious, and there is a part of me that believes I owe it to myself to hear whatever she has to say, rather than wonder about it for the rest of my days." Julian studied her for a long moment, clearly torn between respecting her judgment and his own protective instincts. "Then I will accompany you, at least as far as the door. I will not have you facing her entirely alone, not after everything that transpired the last time you sat across a table from that family." Margaret found she did not object to his insistence, grateful, despite her newfound courage, for the quiet reassurance of his presence. She folded Charlotte's letter carefully and tucked it into her pocket, aware of her aunt watching the exchange with poorly hidden worry. Her earlier joy at Julian and Margaret's tender moment, now tempered by concern over what fresh trouble the Vane family might bring. "You need not decide tonight," her aunt said gently. "Take the evening to consider whether you truly wish to hear whatever Lady Vane has to say. There is no shame in choosing peace over confrontation, not after everything you have already endured." Margaret considered her aunt's words carefully as the three of them walked back toward the house, the earlier warmth of the garden now shadowed slightly by the letter's unwelcome arrival. She thought of Charlotte's face on the night of the dinner, pale and shaken as her uncle's crimes were exposed, and of the brief, unreadable glance Charlotte had cast toward her before fleeing the hall. There had been something in that glance, Margaret realized now, that had never quite left her memory, some flicker of feeling she had been too overwhelmed to properly examine at the time. "I do not think I could rest easy, wondering what she meant to say," Margaret admitted finally. "Whatever weighs on her conscience, I would rather hear it plainly than imagine 100 different possibilities in the quiet hours when sleep will not come." Julian nodded slowly, accepting her decision, even as concern remained visible in his expression. "Then we will go together, as far as propriety allows. I only ask that you allow me to wait nearby should you need anything at all during the conversation." Margaret agreed, grateful for his steady presence even as uncertainty settled over the remainder of the evening, the earlier tenderness of the garden now tangled together with apprehension about what tomorrow's meeting might bring. The tea house sat at the quiet edge of the village, its windows fogged faintly with the morning chill. Margaret arrived early, Julian walking beside her until they reached the door, where he pressed her hand gently and promised to wait across the street, close enough to reach her quickly should she need him. Margaret watched him settle onto a bench with a newspaper he clearly had no intention of reading, and felt steadied by the knowledge that he would not truly leave her alone, whatever unfolded inside. Margaret stepped inside, the warm smell of tea and fresh bread greeting her as the door swung shut behind her, muffling the sounds of the street. The tea house was nearly empty at this early hour, only a handful of tables occupied by villagers taking their morning meal, none of them paying particular attention to the two women about to meet in the corner near the window. Margaret smoothed the front of her dress, an old habit from years of second-guessing her own appearance in unfamiliar company, though she caught herself and let her hands fall still. She had nothing left to prove to Charlotte Vane, whatever the coming conversation might bring. Charlotte was already seated when Margaret entered, and the change in her appearance struck Margaret immediately. Gone was the polished confidence that had commanded the Duke's dinner table a month earlier. Charlotte's dress, though still fine, showed signs of a wardrobe no longer refreshed with the season's latest fashions, and her face carried the particular exhaustion of someone who had spent many recent nights without sufficient sleep. "Thank you for coming," Charlotte said, rising slightly as Margaret approached the table. "I was not certain you would." "I nearly did not," Margaret admitted, taking the seat across from her. "I am still uncertain what purpose this meeting serves." Charlotte's hands wrapped tightly around her teacup, as though seeking warmth or steadiness or both. "I owe you an apology, Miss Ashford, a genuine one, not the sort offered to satisfy propriety while privately believing no wrong was truly done. I have thought of little else these past weeks besides the cruelty I showed you at that dinner, and I find I cannot rest easy until I have said so plainly." Margaret studied her carefully, searching for the calculation she remembered from that evening, the practiced malice that had led the table's mockery with such casual ease. She found instead something that looked genuinely like shame, raw and uncomfortable, the expression of someone unaccustomed to admitting fault. "Why did you do it?" Margaret asked. "The mockery, I mean. You could not have known, that evening, that the Duke intended to expose your uncle, or could you?" Charlotte's gaze dropped to her teacup. "I suspected something was planned, though I did not know the full extent of it until the Duke began to speak. My uncle had grown anxious in recent months, careful in ways he had never been before, and I overheard enough fragments of conversation to understand that old business dealings from years past had somehow resurfaced. I did not know the details, but I feared enough to want you discredited before whatever was coming could unfold." "So you attacked me to protect him," Margaret said quietly. "I attacked you to protect myself," Enrollet, Charlotte corrected, her voice barely above a whisper. "My family's fortune has depended on my uncle's generosity for years, ever since my own father's poor investments left us with considerably less than society believed. I have spent my entire adult life maintaining an appearance of wealth and standing that was never truly mine, terrified always that the truth would emerge and I would be exposed as precisely the kind of fraud I accused you of representing that evening." Margaret absorbed this slowly, feeling something shift in her understanding of the woman sitting across from her. She had spent weeks imagining Charlotte as simply cruel, a woman who enjoyed the exercise of casual power over those she considered beneath her. She had not considered that Charlotte's cruelty might have grown from the same soil of fear and desperation that had shaped so much of Margaret's own difficult years, though expressed in an entirely different direction. "I did not choose this life," Charlotte continued, her voice growing steadier now that the initial confession had passed. I was raised from girlhood to believe that a woman's security depended entirely on the impressions she managed to create, the connections she cultivated, the marriage she eventually secured. My mother drilled these lessons into me before I was old enough to question them, and by the time I was old enough to see the cost of maintaining such a life, I no longer knew how to live any other way. When my uncle's generosity became the only thing standing between my family and genuine poverty, I told myself that protecting his standing was simply protecting my own future, and I stopped asking too many questions about how that standing had been built. Margaret listened without interrupting, recognizing something uncomfortably familiar in Charlotte's description, though their circumstances had led them to such different places. Margaret, too, had once believed her family's security depended on appearances, on the good opinion of neighbors and acquaintances, until poverty had stripped that belief away entirely and forced her to find worth in something sturdier than reputation. That does not excuse what you did, Margaret said carefully. Fear does not give a person license to wound others. No, Charlotte agreed immediately. It does not, and I do not offer my circumstances as excuse, only as explanation. I have spent 5 years watching families fall from grace overnight, watching the same society that once welcomed them turn cold and dismissive the moment their fortunes failed. I became so afraid of that fate befalling my own family that I convinced myself cruelty toward others was simply the price of self-protection. I see now how wrong that was, and how much damage it caused, both to you and, I think, to whatever decency I once possessed before fear reshaped me into someone I do not particularly like. Margaret found herself unexpectedly moved by the raw honesty of Charlotte's words, so different from the careless malice she remembered. What has become of you, since that evening? I confess I have wondered, though I was not certain I wanted to know. My uncle's disgrace has cost my family what remained of our standing, Charlotte said. The engagement I had been quietly negotiating with a viscount's son dissolved within days of the scandal breaking, his family unwilling to associate with anyone connected to fraud, however distantly. My mother has taken to her bed with what the physicians call nervous exhaustion, though I suspect it is closer to grief, for a life we can no longer afford to pretend we still lead. I have spent the past month learning, rather painfully, what it feels like to be the one society whispers about. Margaret felt an unexpected pang of sympathy, though she was careful not to let it fully soften her guarded caution. That must be difficult. It is, Charlotte said, and I recognize the particular unkindness of expecting sympathy from the very person I once tried to humiliate, for far less severe circumstances. I do not ask for your pity, Miss Ashford. I ask only for your forgiveness, if you find yourself able to offer it, and I wish to say plainly, before I lose the courage, that I am deeply sorry for the pain I caused you that evening, and for every small cruelty in the weeks and months before it that I never bothered to properly consider. Margaret sat quietly for a long moment, weighing the sincerity of Charlotte's words against the memory of humiliation that still occasionally surfaced in quiet, unguarded moments. Forgiveness did not come easily, not after years of hardship compounded by that final, public cruelty. But she thought too of her father's steady kindness, of the man he had been before disgrace and grief had worn him down, and she found herself wanting to honor that memory by extending the same grace he had always shown others, even when it was difficult. I forgive you, Margaret said finally, and found, somewhat to her surprise, that she meant it. Not because what you did was acceptable, but because I understand, now, that cruelty often grows from fear rather than malice, and I do not wish to carry bitterness towards someone who has clearly already suffered for her choices. Charlotte's eyes filled with tears she made no attempt to hide. Thank you. I did not expect such generosity, and I am not certain I deserve it, but I am grateful for it regardless. They sat together a while longer, the conversation growing gradually easier, less burdened by the weight of confession and apology. Charlotte spoke, hesitantly at first, of her uncertain future, the reduced circumstances her family now faced, the strange freedom she had discovered in no longer needing to maintain an appearance of wealth she had never truly possessed. There is a curious relief in it, Charlotte admitted, turning her teacup slowly between her fingers. For years I measured every conversation, every invitation, every gown, against whether it preserved the illusion my mother insisted we maintain. Now that the illusion has collapsed entirely, I find I no longer have to perform quite so carefully. I do not know yet what will become of us, whether we will manage on what little remains or whether we will need to accept a far more modest situation than either of us ever imagined, but I confess there is something almost freeing in no longer pretending. I understand that feeling better than you might expect, Margaret said. There was a strange relief, even in the depths of our hardship, in no longer needing to pretend my father's fortune was intact. no longer needing to smile through gatherings where everyone quietly knew the truth of our circumstances. Poverty is difficult, but it does teach a person which comforts truly matter, and which were only ever performance. Margaret found herself offering practical advice where she could, small suggestions drawn from her own years of learning to manage a household on modest means, which cloth merchants offered fair prices without judgment, which tradesmen could be trusted to extend patience during difficult months, how to make a small store of coal last through the coldest weeks of winter. Charlotte received this advice with genuine gratitude rather than the wounded pride Margaret might once have expected from her, taking small notes on a scrap of paper as though determined to remember every detail. "I never imagined I would sit across from you seeking guidance on frugal living," Charlotte said, with the first real trace of humor Margaret had seen from her all morning. "Life has a curious sense of irony, does it not?" "It does indeed," Margaret agreed, allowing herself a small smile in return, "though I find I do not mind the irony nearly so much as I once might have expected." When they finally parted outside the tea house, Charlotte paused before turning to leave. "I hope you find happiness, Miss Ashford, with the Duke, or wherever your life leads. You have earned it more than most." Margaret watched her walk away, feeling the last of her old bitterness finally loosen its grip, replaced by something calmer, something closer to peace. She crossed the street to where Julian waited, his newspaper long abandoned on the bench beside him, and slipped her hand into his without needing to explain the conversation in detail. "You are smiling," he observed, studying her expression carefully. "I confess I expected you to emerge rather more troubled." "I expected it too," Margaret admitted, "but I find I feel lighter, somehow, having heard her out. Cruelty is easier to forgive once you understand the fear that shaped it, even when the fear does not excuse the wound it caused." They walked together through the village, the autumn afternoon mild and golden around them, and Margaret found herself reflecting on the extraordinary distance she had traveled since that first humiliating dinner. She thought of her father, and the peace she hoped he had finally found in whatever quiet corner of memory remained of him now that his name had been properly restored. She thought of her aunt, tending roses in a garden neither of them had dared imagine owning a month earlier, and she thought of Julian, walking steadily beside her, his hand warm around hers, offering not rescue exactly, but partnership, the quiet promise of a future built on honesty rather than fear. "I have been thinking," Julian said, breaking the comfortable silence between them, "about what comes next. For us." Margaret glanced up at him, her heart quickening slightly at the careful seriousness in his tone. "What have you been thinking, Your Grace?" "Julian," he corrected gently, though he was smiling, "and I have been thinking that I would very much like to make our arrangement more permanent, if you are willing. I do not offer this lightly, nor do I offer it out of guilt for how our acquaintance began. I offer it because I have come to know you these past weeks as someone of extraordinary courage and grace, someone I would be honored to spend the remainder of my life beside." Margaret felt her breath catch, the golden afternoon light suddenly seeming brighter around them. "Are you asking me to marry you, Julian?" "Oh, I am," he said, "though I confess I have never asked anyone such a question before, and I fear I am managing it rather clumsily." Margaret laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound that surprised her with its ease. "You are managing it perfectly well, and my answer is yes, though I suspect you already knew that before you asked." Julian's answering smile held none of the careful guardedness she had first encountered at his dinner table a month earlier, only open, unmistakable joy. He reached into his coat and produced a small ring, simple and elegant, clearly chosen with far more thought than the impulsive nature of his proposal might have suggested. "I have carried this for a week," he admitted, waiting for the right moment, though I confess I had planned something rather more polished than a village street after a difficult conversation with Lady Vane. I hope the setting does not diminish the sincerity of the question." "It does not," Margaret said, extending her hand as he slipped the ring gently onto her finger. "I think, given everything that brought us to this moment, an ordinary village street suits us rather better than some grand rehearsed occasion. Our story was never going to follow the usual pattern." "No," Julian agreed. "I suppose it was not." They walked on together, past the small shops and familiar faces of the village that had once whispered so unkindly about Margaret's circumstances, and now simply nodded in friendly greeting as they passed. Word of the engagement would spread quickly, Margaret knew, carried on the same currents of gossip that had once spread word of her family's disgrace. But this time, she found she did not fear the whispers. She had nothing left to hide, no shame to guard against exposure, only a future she intended to build honestly, in full view of whoever cared to watch. That evening, seated in the small parlor of her new home with her aunt, Margaret shared the news, watching her aunt's face light with a joy that had been absent for far too many years. Her aunt embraced her tightly, tears gathering once again, though these were tears of pure happiness rather than the complicated grief that had marked so many of their recent months together. "Your father would be so proud," her aunt said softly, echoing words Julian had spoken weeks earlier in the aftermath of that first difficult dinner, not simply because of the Duke's title, though I will admit that brings its own comfort after everything we endured. "He would be proud because you never once let the world's cruelty convince you of a lie about your own worth. You held fast to the truth, even when it cost you dearly, and now that truth has brought you here." Margaret held her aunt close, thinking of her father's steady voice, his patient kindness, the quiet courage he had shown even in his final, difficult days. She thought of the frightened girl who had first walked into Ashcombe Hall dreading every moment of the evening ahead, and of how far that girl had traveled since, through humiliation and vindication, through grief and forgiveness, into a future she had once believed entirely beyond her reach. Whatever challenges still lay ahead, and she knew there would be challenges, the adjustment to a new title and new responsibilities, the careful navigation of society still curious about her rapid change in fortune, she faced them now with a steadiness she had earned through 5 hard years of survival. She was no longer the disgraced merchant's daughter, mocked and dismissed at a stranger's dinner table. She was Margaret Ashford, soon to be Duchess of Ashcombe, and she intended to carry that name, like her fathers before her, with honesty, courage, and an unshakable devotion to the truth. 6 months passed before the wedding took place, 6 months that Margaret would later remember as some of the busiest and most transformative of her life. There were arrangements to make, a household to learn, an entirely new set of responsibilities that came with the title she had once believed so far beyond her reach. Julian proved a patient teacher, guiding her through the complexities of managing a great estate, without ever making her feel inadequate for not having been raised to such a role. "You learn quickly," he told her one afternoon, watching her review the household accounts with a careful eye that had been sharpened by years of stretching a modest budget as far as it could possibly go. "Faster than I did, if I am honest. I fumbled through my first year managing Ashcombe's finances rather badly, before my steward finally took pity and taught me properly." "I have simply had different practice," Margaret said, though she could not entirely suppress her pride at the compliment. "Managing a household on very little teaches a person to notice every shilling. Managing one with abundance, I find, only requires applying the same careful attention to a much larger sum." The staff at Ashcombe Hall took to her gradually, cautious at first around a mistress whose rise to the title had been so unusual and so publicly discussed, but won over steadily by her genuine warmth and her habit of remembering small details about their lives, a housemaid's ailing mother, a groundskeeper's son newly apprenticed in the village. Margaret had not forgotten what it felt like to be overlooked or dismissed, and she made a quiet point of ensuring no one beneath her roof ever felt as invisible as she once had at other people's tables. "The staff adore you," Julian observed one evening, watching her exchange a few warm words with the young footman who had once served that fateful dinner months earlier. "I do not think Ashcombe Hall has felt this alive in years, perhaps not since my mother was still living. I only try to treat them as I would have wished to be treated, during the years I had so little," Margaret said. "It costs nothing to remember that everyone carries burdens we cannot always see." Her aunt settled comfortably into her role as a beloved fixture of Ashcombe Hall, her rose garden expanding each season under the estate's more generous resources, her quiet wisdom sought increasingly by the staff and even by Julian himself, who had grown genuinely fond of the woman who had raised Margaret through the hardest years of her life. The great house that had once seemed so cold and unwelcoming to Margaret during that first humiliating dinner gradually became something she recognized as home, filled now with warmth and laughter rather than judgment and cruelty. News reached them occasionally of Lord Carow, stripped of his title's privileges and living now in considerably reduced circumstances at a distant property, his once considerable influence entirely dissolved. Margaret found she felt little beyond a distant, settled satisfaction at the news, the sharp edges of her old anger having softened considerably in the months since the truth had finally come to light. She had spent enough of her life carrying anger and grief. She found she preferred, now, to spend her energy on the future rather than dwelling further on a past that could no longer touch her. Charlotte, to Margaret's genuine surprise, became an occasional correspondent, her letters growing warmer and more genuine with each exchange. She had taken a position as a companion to an elderly widow in a neighboring county, modest work that nonetheless offered her a measure of independence she had never possessed during her years of maintaining false appearances for her mother's sake. Margaret found herself looking forward to Charlotte's letters, an unlikely friendship having grown slowly from the ashes of that difficult tea-house conversation, built now on an honesty neither of them had previously extended to the other. "I never imagined we would become friends," Charlotte wrote in one letter, "given how our acquaintance began. I am grateful, more than I can properly express, that you were willing to see past my worst behavior, toward whatever decency remained beneath it." Margaret wrote back promptly, assuring Charlotte that people were rarely defined entirely by their worst moments, a lesson she herself had learned slowly and painfully over the difficult years following her father's disgrace. She had been defined, for 5 long years, by circumstances entirely beyond her control, judged and dismissed by people who knew nothing of her true character. She had no wish to extend that same unfair judgment toward someone who had shown genuine remorse and genuine effort to change. In time, Charlotte visited Ashcombe Hall herself, a cautious first visit that grew warmer as the day progressed, the two women walking together through the gardens Margaret's aunt had cultivated so carefully, speaking easily now of matters far removed from that difficult first dinner. Julian, watching them from a distance, remarked once that he found it remarkable, the friendship that had grown from such an unpromising beginning, and Margaret had simply smiled, thinking privately that perhaps unpromising beginnings were not so unusual a foundation for genuine connection, given how her own story with Julian had begun in much the same uncertain place. The wedding itself, when it finally arrived on a bright spring morning, was a modest affair by the standards of Ashcombe's usual grandeur, held in the small village church rather than some grander cathedral in the city. Margaret had insisted on this, wanting her father's memory honored in the same humble setting where her parents had married decades earlier, and Julian had agreed without hesitation, understanding instinctively why such a choice mattered to her. Her aunt walked her down the narrow aisle, since Margaret had no living father to perform the honor, and Margaret felt her father's absence keenly in that moment, a bittersweet ache beneath the day's overwhelming joy. She thought of him often during the ceremony, wondering what he might have thought of the man she was marrying, of the strange and difficult path that had led her here, of the justice finally delivered 5 years after his death had first seemed to end all hope for their family's future. The small church was decorated simply, wildflowers gathered from the surrounding fields rather than costly imported blooms, and Margaret found the simplicity fitting for a day that meant to honor humble beginnings rather than obscure them. She wore her mother's blue silk, altered and refreshed for the occasion, the same dress she had worn to that first fateful dinner at Ashcombe Hall, a quiet symbol of how far she had traveled without ever needing to abandon where she had come from. Julian, watching her approach from the altar, wore an expression Margaret had never seen from him before, something entirely unguarded, joy without any trace of the careful stillness that had once defined him. She thought, watching him watch her, of how far they had both traveled from that first difficult dinner, two people shaped by loss and caution, who had somehow found in each other the courage to hope again. The vows they exchanged were simple, traditional words spoken in front of a small gathering of villagers, staff, and the few society acquaintances who had proven genuinely loyal through the difficult months of scandal and vindication. Margaret felt none of the anxiety that had gripped her during that first dinner at Ashcombe Hall, only a steady, grounded certainty that she had finally found the place where she truly belonged. Afterward, as the small wedding party gathered for a modest celebration in the village hall, decorated simply with flowers from her aunt's garden, Margaret found a quiet moment to step outside alone, needing a breath of the cool spring air, before returning to the warmth and noise of celebration. She stood beneath the same sky that had witnessed 5 years of grief and hardship, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could properly remember, entirely at peace with everything that had brought her to this moment. Julian found her there a few minutes later, slipping his hand into hers without a word, content simply to stand beside her in comfortable silence. "Are you happy?" he asked finally, studying her expression with the careful attention that had become so familiar to her over the past months. "I am," Margaret said, and found the words carried none of the uncertainty she might once have expected herself to feel. "I spent so many years believing happiness was something reserved for other people, people whose fathers had not been ruined, whose families had not fallen into disgrace and poverty. I forgot, somewhere in those difficult years, that happiness was still something I was allowed to want." "You are allowed to want it now," Julian said gently, "and I intend to spend the remainder of my life ensuring you have every reason to feel it." Margaret leaned into him, watching the last light of the spring afternoon settle golden over the village she had once feared would define her entirely by scandal and shame. She thought of her father one final time, hoping wherever his memory rested, he understood that his daughter had carried his name through the darkest years imaginable, and emerged, finally, into a life built on truth, courage, and a love neither cruelty nor fear had managed to destroy. She thought, too, of the frightened girl who had first stepped into Ashcombe Hall's grand dining room, certain she did not belong among the powerful and the titled, certain the evening ahead held only humiliation. That girl could never have imagined standing here now, in this same village, wearing her mother's blue silk transformed into a wedding gown, married to the very man whose careful, determined pursuit of justice had changed the entire course of her life. Every hardship, every cruel word endured at that first dinner, every sleepless night spent grieving her father's ruined name, had led her, improbably and against all reasonable expectation, to this quiet moment of peace. They returned to the celebration together, hand in hand, ready to begin whatever came next, no longer burdened by the shame of the past, but carried instead by the steady, hard-won knowledge that truth, given enough time and enough courage, always found its way into the light.